Hello there. Wouldn't it be nice if every time there was wildness and chaos, you could just snap your fingers and everything would go back to how it's supposed to be? Uh, Today we're going to be in the book of Exodus, the first couple of chapters of Exodus, which is the narrative of the birth of Moses. And I'd like to tell you that story here for a second. Um, oh no. Oh no, I can't remember. Does anyone remember the story of when Moses was born?
I do.
You do? Okay, how does it go?
Well, Moses was born, and his mom put him in a basket. Then he was floating down a river, and then another mom found him.
That's it. You're right. Okay, well, thanks for helping us out today. You guys can go inside or back there or whatever you want to do.
I'll go inside.
That's a good idea.
I'll go inside.
That's a good idea. All right, so that is the brief synopsis of the story of Moses. You remember at the beginning of Exodus that we're coming out of the book of Genesis where Joseph and his family have moved into Egypt, and God has watched over that family and prospered them and helped them to survive the famine. And now they've been there for quite some time. And we turn the page to the book of Exodus. Exodus, of course, is one of the great books of the Bible, full of suspense, full of surprise, full of irony. We want to touch on some of those themes here today. And of course, it's the great story of the Exodus itself, which is the foundation for the history of Israel and Christianity as well, and the ties that it has to who Jesus is and what he has done. So we begin in Exodus, and we note that in Exodus chapter 1, the backstory building up to this story of Moses is that we see that the sons of Israel have been in Egypt for a while, but a new Pharaoh, a new king of Egypt, arises who does not know of Joseph, does not know of that family or that story or why they're there. In fact, he has quite a different opinion of these people. The text says in verse 7 of chapter 1 that the sons of Israel were fruitful and increasing greatly, and they multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. You might hear echoes there, intentional echoes of very important, another foundational story in the Bible, which is the story of Genesis, the creation narratives in Genesis chapter 1. There we hear of the Great Commission and great blessing of God to be fruitful and multiply and all the rest of that were created in God's image. And we have this commission to care for God's world and God's creation. And there's this blessing and this Sabbath rest and all as well. And that's kind of the picture, the goal for humanity and creation. We see in Exodus chapter 1 intentional echoes of that language to say that even in this place, even in Egypt, which is not the land promised to Abraham and his descendants, but even in this place, there is this fulfillment and realization of the goal and the task and the blessing of that picture in Genesis, that the sons of Israel were being fruitful, they were multiplying, they were filling the land. Now, in that context, the new king doesn't like that. This new Pharaoh sees that as a threat. And in the story, Pharaoh functions as the foil. He functions as this agent of creation. He's not even named. Pharaoh, is just a title, but it's used kind of like the name of a person. We don't even know, there's not a reference to a historical Pharaoh here, it's just called Pharaoh. And this character in the story represents this pull and this draw away from the intentions of creation in Genesis 1 back to these states of chaos. It's sort of as the story unfolds, it's sort of an attempt by this character to reverse the blessing and the commission of creation, and to return it to this state of chaos, and maybe even curse. So that's what is happening in the text. There's the Pharaoh, and then there's the sons of Israel. And what we see here is that there is a boy that is born, and his name obviously is Moses. Now, in the Hebrew text, there's in chapter 2 now, there's sort of play on words that occurs where the name Moses is sort of being associated with the word for drawing, for drawing out of the water. And so there's a Hebrew attribution there about whether he was drawn out. Really, the word is probably more about him doing the drawing. So there's going to be connections between Moses drawing people out of the water, and that function that he'll have later in the story of helping to draw people through the waters to their salvation. But Moses is really an Egyptian name, and you might recognize that as a classic ending to a lot of Egyptian names, like Ramses or Tutmos or lots of other Egyptian names. They'll have this suffix on the end, which is the same consonants that Moses has in his name. And so Moses' name really means that he's born of someone, the son of, the child of someone. But in the case of Ramses, for instance, we would know that Ramses is born of the god Ra. He's the son of Ra. So there's, the name can stand by itself, but usually there's another prefix in front of it designating the god. And so one of the interesting literary functions of that name is that we're kind of left to ask the question, well, here's a person, Moses, and he's the son of someone, the child of someone, but we wonder who. And that's part of the irony in the text, the literary irony of the text. Not only is there a question of whose biological child this is in the text, and there's some great surprise in the text there about what's happening in the narrative, the plot of the narrative, but also we might be asking, well, whose son is this in relation to God? Or in other words, well, who's God? Who is the God of this child, this Moses? Is it the Egyptian god Ra or some other Egyptian god? Who might it be? And so the story of this text is going to be the answer to that question. Who is the God of Moses? Who is the God of these sons of Israel? And that will be important, of course, as the story unfolds. But here at the beginning, we see just those early questions developing as we tell this birth narrative, this story of Moses. Another one of the great ironies in the text is that Moses, the great deliverer, the great liberator, the great savior of this nation of what are at this point Hebrew slaves, he himself needs saving, needs rescuing. And that is, I think, an important literary point, but also an important theological point as well. You remember a Christmas or two ago, we kind of went at the story from the other side, starting in the birth narratives of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, making note of the fact that the way that Matthew, from the very first words of his Gospel, is tying into this Genesis and Exodus tradition. Specifically, first of all, the story and narratives of Genesis. And he wants to show basically that Jesus, and this story of Jesus, the genealogy, the generations that result in this story of Jesus, are sort of like the next chapter of Genesis. And he has echoes of Joseph connecting up with the Joseph and the Genesis narratives, and both of those have salvific functions in the text. And then, of course, the narrative of Matthew moves into echoes of Exodus, and Jesus, of course, is portrayed as a second Moses or new Moses. So there's a lot of interesting connections between the texts there. But in both narratives, and here in the especially in the original story that's being echoed in the Gospels, the story of Exodus, we see that one of the great ironies of the text is that there are unsung heroes, these lowly, unassuming heroes in the text that are actually the saviors of the Savior. Just as Joseph and Mary have served that same function in the birth narratives of Jesus, so too in the text of Exodus. We have 5 women who throughout the story here in the plot eventually end up working in all of their own ways, working together to, in effect, save the Savior, to save Moses. Because you remember, one of the ways that Pharaoh wants to deal with this this population and perceived threat of the Israelites, the sons of Israel, is he wants to do some sort of population control. And he wants to kill all of the firstborn male, and he wants to have their mothers throw them in the Nile. Well, there are some maidservants, 2 maidservants that play a role in the text, as well as Moses' mother, obviously. And then if you read the narrative in chapter 2, Moses' sister and the daughter of Pharaoh. These 5 women all play a role, a small but important role, in preserving the life of Moses, to the point where we can almost be laughing as we're reading along with the text in this great joy and irony that happens in the plot, because in the end Moses' mother actually ends up receiving her child back after she had placed him in the reeds on the near the shore of the river, and the child is found. And then the way that the text unfolds, Moses' mother actually receives her own child back to feed him, and she ends up getting paid to do so. So wouldn't that be nice if that worked out that way for every mother, that you could get paid just for feeding your own child? And maybe that should be the case anyway. But anyway, that's a funny part of the story. So it's filled with those sorts of elements of surprise, elements of suspense, elements of irony in the text. And all of that is building up to this story of Moses, who will grow up to be a man and play a significant role in the history of these people. The last thing I want to point out here is the question that we might be asking in the text, and that's the question, where is God? God is surprisingly not on the scene in these texts, although he's mentioned by name or by title a couple of times, referred to a couple of times. We see the faithfulness of these heroic women who are being faithful to God, and there's a memory of God and a faithfulness to God, but he's not on the scene, at least not overtly. We wait until chapter 3 for God to make his grand appearance to Moses at the burning bush, and that, of course, is where he reveals his the divine name and that sort of thing. But the first 2 chapters of Exodus open in a state of tribulation and trial and distress and suspense and darkness. And you might be asking, well, where is God in all of this? And I think that's part of the question that the text is wanting us to ask. And of course, we see the way that the narrative turns out, that we're basically meant to conclude that certainly God is here. The way that he's brings about this protection of Moses, the way that he saves the Savior, the same way that Mary and Joseph do in the Gospels. The way that that works itself out, we're meant to understand that although God is not overtly present, although he hasn't made himself known demonstrably like he does at the theophany in the burning bush, he is meant to be understood as being at work behind the scenes. And I think that's an important note for us as we read the text. And those are the two angles, topics I want us to be reflecting on today, and maybe we could put them in the form of a question too for reflection and discussion. First of all, the unsung heroes, the people of low estate that function as the saviors of the Savior, these heroic women in the text. We see that even small acts of faith on their part have what in Exodus is basically being understood as cosmic consequences. These are not just small moments in history, but these are reflections of great things that will eventually unfold, not only in the history of Israel, but in the history of the cosmos. These have connections to the origin stories in Genesis 1, etc. So we might be able to ask, what do I see the opportunities that I have in life to have those small acts of faith? Do I see those in the same way that God does? Because God sees those as very significant. Small acts of faith, even ones that are unsung, unnoticed, ones that are seemingly of very little import. We never know what sort of cosmic consequences for good those might have for families, for nations, for the world down the line. So every single small act of faith that we have set before us to do, they are important to do, and we never know how much of an impact they have. So we can ask, do I appreciate those small opportunities of small acts of faith that are before me on a daily basis that may not seem like they're that important, but to God they're very important. And secondly, the question of where is God in the text. The story, the early chapters of Exodus here sort of are meant to foster this hope, and you can see the effect this would have throughout Israel's history. You know, reading this story at various times throughout their history, whether they're in the land or in captivity or whatever. Sometimes life feels like all of the good, all of the blessing, all of the things that, all of the order and meaning of life it seems like there are forces at work to reverse that and to oppress and to really maybe even bring us into a state of oppression or trouble or tribulation. And in those dark places, stories like these that we see, that even in those dark places, there is such a thing as hope. Even when God seems absent, hasn't made himself known in a dramatic way, like at the burning bush, even in tribulation, even in darkness, there is divine possibility. And God is at work even when we don't see it. So maybe we can ask, even when I am in a difficult situation, and maybe you are right now, many of us are, do I still trust that God is at work? Maybe not even overtly, but behind the scenes, meaning intending to bring about what is good, even in the darkest times, recognizing that because of God, there is always possibility. Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.